Well, welcome back and a very good afternoon to all of you. Did you all have a great lunch break? Yes? Fantastic discovery sessions as well? Brilliant. I hope we are all learning so much at this Women's Forum. And of course, continue to use those breaks to network and meet other incredibly empowered women. Now, to begin our afternoon and give us a dose of inspiration, I have the great privilege of welcoming our next guest, who will be talking about her deep experience in global diplomacy, leadership, and advocacy for women's rights. She is none other than the former Australian Minister for Defence, as well as for Foreign Affairs, and Professor of Practice from Western Sydney University, Distinguished Visiting Fellow of the Hoover Institute. Please welcome onto the stage, Marise Payne. Very warm welcome to you, Marise. Please have a seat. And we've got this incredibly empowered audience in front of us. However, we only have 15 minutes for our chat, which isn't nearly enough.
Not good for a former politician, no.
Absolutely. But again, you know, you've had all these extraordinary experiences at the height of your political career, Minister of Defence, Minister of Foreign Affairs for Australia. Give us a sense of what's been the most rewarding experience for you in your career.
I think after more than 2.5 decades in Australian politics, but also working across the region, I think forging those key relationships between partners and allies in this part of the world, but also the opportunity to work with some of the most extraordinary women I've ever met in my life, who are leaders in the Indo-Pacific, being able to acknowledge them as close personal friends, people like Retno Marsudi, the Foreign Minister of Indonesia, who really is a remarkable woman and a remarkable leader, and someone who I am proud to call a friend. But those opportunities to work with those partners to support, to work with and for women in the Indo-Pacific, some of whom don't enjoy the same advantages that you've enjoyed, I've enjoyed, and many leaders who I think are presenting in these 2 days of this conference have enjoyed. So being able to make a difference in the lives of some, being Foreign Minister is an opportunity to use things like development assistance in nations which are struggling, to make sure that in delivering that support, women are front and centre of any assessment that you are making. So that is a real privilege and something that I've enjoyed enormously.
And that is so crucial, isn't it? We talked earlier today about confidence, about really enabling younger women to look to role models like yourselves, other women in leadership, to really get that sense of, yes, we do belong here. Yes, we can do these extraordinary things. We've got quite a few young people in the audience, and to all these young women who are aspiring to be, an extraordinary leader in their field, much like yourself, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, they might not want advice from an almost 2.5 decades or more than 2.5 decades old politician, but the one piece of advice that I was given and took and don't regret is don't miss opportunities that come your way. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. You might see an opportunity in work, in my case in politics, that you think is not just exactly right. But honestly, if you have the drive and the ambition to succeed and you can see an opportunity that you might be able to work to your advantage, where you can make a real contribution, don't ignore it if it doesn't happen to be perfect. I think that is also slightly generational. I think 30 years ago in Australian politics, I just grabbed every opportunity on the basis that it would help me make a contribution. So I grabbed it with both hands. Now, I think my 22-year-old niece might say, it's not perfect, and move on. I don't know what she'll think in 10 years' time or 15 years' time or 20 years' time. If she looks back at giving up that opportunity, might she say, maybe I should have done that in 2024 because maybe it would have enabled me to work in another country or another city or whatever it might be, another area. So don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, I would say.
Absolutely. And it was very different for people like us of that different era. We know we've been talking a lot this morning about technology, AI, tech as a vector for inclusion is the theme of this conference. But there are so many threats out there for the next generation. It's going to be a very different world for them, isn't it? So what kind of advice would you give them in sense of, how to prepare for it? What are you going to tell your 22-year-old niece?
I'm going to tell her that I expected the world to be different, and it has not changed as much as I thought it would.
Okay.
So it's changed a lot, I think. But for workplace equality, for gender equality in terms of wages and salaries, I don't think the changes have been as comprehensive as I thought they would. I thought that women her age would not have to worry or think about that. Yeah. And so workplace gender equality is something that, and I had responsibility for a period for the Workplace Gender Equality Agency in Australia. It's a really important entity at the government level which monitors workplace and salaries of women in comparable jobs, men comparable jobs, etc., and does all of that analysis. I thought that would have changed significantly, and it didn't change as much as I expected. So being very conscious of standing up for what is your right in terms of equality is also important. I'm an advocate of critical mass on those sorts of environments because it can be intimidating, no question. It's intimidating in a political workplace, it's intimidating in a commercial workplace, it's intimidating anywhere. So making sure that you have fellow travellers with you. And the other thing which has always been important in my career and which has been, I think, important for many women I know who have made it to very senior levels, is to take the support of mentors, male and female, who are prepared to back you and make sure that you absorb that advice, that experience from both. And I was the beneficiary of great mentoring from men and from women in Australia in my career, and I'm very grateful for that.
That's wonderful, and that's something we've been hearing a lot of this morning, the need for strong mentors, and as you say, they could be men, they could be women, but people you look up to, people who can give you, really amazing advice about life, career, everything, right?
Including the what not to do, yes.
Yes, absolutely, you're right. Now, it's interesting you mention how obviously the gender wage gap still exists. It exists in Australia. It existed at the BBC, where I worked for about 20 years. And it does exist universally. It's going to take, over 100 years? What was that statistic about women trying to get to the same? It is more than a century before women earn as much as men. So it really is quite shocking. I'm also reminded of, your wonderful country, Australia, which has made such strides. We heard yesterday on the barometer study that was conducted, Australia really leading a lot of the region when it comes to women in positions of senior leadership. However, more than 10 years ago, your one female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, made a speech in Parliament. It was 2012, and it was a really scathing speech about misogynism, because really, as you say, it's a very polarizing world. Things are changing, but back then it was a particular sort of climate that wasn't very friendly to her. Do you think it's changed now, almost, more than a decade later? And what areas do you believe require really urgent attention for ensuring a much more equitable and peaceful world?
I think that's a very good question, and it was a very impactful speech in the Australian Parliament. And Julia Gillard and I have sat on the opposite sides of politics for our political careers, but have a great regard for the contribution that particularly she's making globally in her role now. I think that things have changed, but there is more to be done. So I would call it a work in progress, in a good way. And I think that there has been concerted effort and focus put in across certainly political systems in Australia to address these issues. Our parliamentary workplaces in Australia, very much based in the Westminster tradition, had not been exposed, in my view, to contemporary workplace requirements sufficiently. We have certainly made changes in the federal parliament in Australia and in our state parliaments to deal with that. And it's not perfect, as I said, and there is more to be done, but I am pleased to have seen some of that progress made. More broadly, though, my particular concentration and focus, both as Foreign Minister and I was also, for a period, Australia's Minister for Women, in a lot of our work, both domestically and regionally, has been on three key areas: on women's economic security, so women's opportunity to participate in the way they want to in the workforce, women's safety, where I am acutely conscious that particularly in parts of the Pacific, family and domestic violence continues to be one of the biggest challenges and biggest barriers to women's full participation, and its impact on girls and boys, frankly, in families is very, very significant. So economic security, safety and leadership, the opportunity to participate is in the systems and processes of whether it is business, whether it is politics in one's own country. So those three areas have been huge focuses of mine for my entire career. I would add to that education, a threshold requirement for participation. And health, and making sure that health systems across our region are capable of doing what they need to do in terms of protecting the basic human rights in each country, but also in terms of the protection of women's health, which has historically, in more places than I care to count, been an afterthought.
Yeah, an afterthought. That's a scary, scary idea. Now, you mentioned obviously so much, this extraordinary wealth of experience that you've had in politics, leading the Women's Department, focusing on those rights. And your professional focus has very much been on working closely with allies, with partners, developing key relationships, including here in Singapore, for greater resilience and strength, strategic strength. So can you discuss particular diplomatic achievement that you've made that you're particularly proud of?
I think it's always difficult to talk about yourself in that way. I mean, in this region, I'm very proud that Australia and ASEAN signed ASEAN's first ever comprehensive strategic partnership. And for me, with my partners in the region, Minister Vivian Balakrishnan here in Singapore, Retno Marsudi, who I mentioned in Indonesia, and many other counterparts from across ASEAN, drove that very hard, and I was particularly proud of that. But I would have to say that during my period as Foreign Minister, we did, of course, experience that extraordinary global challenge, the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we needed to do was to literally flick a switch and change our support and our development assistance programs and our regional engagement to assist a vast number of regional partners in terms of COVID response, particularly in the Pacific and some also in Southeast Asia. We have a great relationship here in Singapore, as you mentioned. We were very pleased to receive, for example, during that period, a number of vaccines from Singapore, which were surplus here at the time, but then we were able to reciprocate broadly around the region. Having a focus also on the health of women in the COVID pandemic was really important to me, but we were able to deliver not just vaccine support, but Australian medical assistance teams in countries which were struggling, which were having enormous challenges with overwhelming levels of COVID-19, to ensure that their health systems functioned, to ensure that they were able to set up vaccination systems for themselves for such a comprehensive challenge. So, it sounds strange to refer to a pandemic response as a diplomatic achievement, but really it helped the region, it helped women, children and their families to survive through that period. Their economies as well, as economies crumbled in the face of closed borders, particularly where they were tourism reliant, when Australia gave budget assistance, for example. So there are many to record, and of course there are always disappointments along the way as well. but being able to say that Australia was a strong and effective and a sound partner for countries dealing with those challenges, that's an enormously proud diplomatic achievement for me.
That is wonderful to hear. Now, we've just got a few more seconds. You have this new role now, an extraordinary new role, professor at Western Sydney University. You're a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute, where you're working very closely with another very powerful woman, Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State a number of years ago in the US. What's your role now, and how can you use that role to continue to empower women?
It's a great question. I call myself a recovering politician, but importantly, I am working with both of those extraordinary institutions, the Hoover Institute at Stanford University in the United States, one of the most prestigious think tanks in the US, largely on global policy and strategy. And I think it's really fascinating for them to have an Australian in their midst, and for me to have the opportunity to work with the senior leadership at Hoover, and it's a great honour for me. At Western Sydney University, we have an extraordinarily diverse student population. We are in the most dynamic and fascinating part of Australia, in my view, which has a massive multicultural and migrant population established over decades now. But for many, it is they are the first in their families to go to university. And that is very impactful in our region. I went to a graduation on Friday and watched 140 new lawyers graduate. I'm not sure everybody wants 140 new lawyers, but I know that they will make a fabulous contribution across our city, but also globally. I know I'll bump into a Western Sydney University graduate sometime this week in Singapore. Because wonderful. That's where they are. Yeah. And I think it's a great story. So my chance to encourage particularly the women in those courses and support the women in leadership in the university and make sure that we are all working towards the same goal of gender equality, but also of promoting fabulous women leaders.
Well, thank you for this extraordinarily positive and empowering session where we're all feeling slightly better about ourselves. Let's face it, we've seen what you've done. We can continue to do that. There are women in positions of leadership that we can look up to, and that's an extraordinary path that you're, led for all of us here. So please give a big round of applause to Marise Payne.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful.